How to graph changes in macroeconomic equilibrium. Have you ever wondered how economists visualize the ups and downs of the economy? Understanding how to graph changes in macroeconomic equilibrium is key to grasping these concepts. Let's break it down step by step. To start, you will need to use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This model illustrates the relationship between the overall price level and the real gross domestic product produced in the economy. The point where the aggregate demand curve meets the aggregate supply curve is known as the equilibrium. This intersection shows the price level and output where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. First, grab a piece of graph paper. On the vertical axis, label it as the price level. On the horizontal axis, label it as real gross domestic product or output. Next, draw your initial aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. The point where these two curves intersect is your initial equilibrium point. This point represents the starting price level and output in the economy. Now think about what might cause a shift in either curve. For instance, if consumer confidence rises or government spending increases, the aggregate demand curve will shift. Conversely, if resource prices rise or there are changes in technology, the aggregate supply curve will shift. Next, determine the direction of the shift. If aggregate demand increases, the curve will move to the right. This indicates higher demand at each price level. If it decreases, the curve shifts to the left. Similarly, if aggregate supply increases, the curve shifts to the right, showing more output at each price level. A decrease shifts it left. Once you know which curve shifts and in what direction, draw the new aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve on the same graph. The new intersection point of the two curves will show the new macroeconomic equilibrium, complete with updated price level and output. Now, compare the original equilibrium point with the new one. This comparison will help you see how the economic change has affected the economy's price level and output. For example, if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, the new equilibrium will typically show a higher price level and higher output, indicating economic growth. On the other hand, if the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, you will see a higher price level but lower output, which can indicate stagnation. This graphical representation is essential for understanding business cycle fluctuations. It illustrates how changes in demand or supply can lead to short-term deviations from long-term growth trends. It also shows how prices and output adjust to return to equilibrium after disturbances. In practice, this method is often used to analyze the impacts of various policies. For example, fiscal stimulus can shift aggregate demand, while supply shocks, like rising oil prices, can shift aggregate supply. Both scenarios affect inflation and economic growth. By mastering these shifts and their graphical representation, you will connect changes in economic conditions to measurable outcomes in price levels and real gross domestic product. This understanding is fundamental to the study of macroeconomics.